It's 5 p.m. here in Lagos, Nigeria. Welcome to The World Today. I'm Joke Rogers. Here's what's coming up on the program. U.S. President Donald Trump, speaking about the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, says Israel should cancel and let hell break loose. Meanwhile, Canada and UK weigh response to Trump's metal tariffs, and trial begins for 84 Congolese soldiers accused of murder. Let's bring you up to speed with what has been happening as regards the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. Jordan's King Abdullah has been meeting with some of the U.S. President Donald Trump's advisors ahead of their scheduled discussion later on. Mr. Trump had suggested he may withhold aid to Jordan and Egypt if they do not cooperate with his plan to take control of Gaza and resettle the population in the two countries. Jordan receives regular payments of at least $1.45 billion each year in military and economic aid from the United States. Along with Israel and Egypt, it's one of the top recipients of U.S. aid in the Middle East. But because its economy is much smaller, the aid plays a much bigger role there, making up around 1% of the country's GDP. Jordan's former deputy prime minister says the country will not be trampled on by the U.S. president. Speaking of the U.S. president, Mr. Trump earlier spoke about the hostage releases between Israel and the Hamas militant group, saying that the ceasefire should be cancelled if all hostages in Gaza are not returned by Saturday. He says he wants all of them, not in twos or threes. Mr. Trump made the comments in the Oval Office where he emphasized that if they are not all returned, all hell is going to break out and that Hamas will find out what I mean. So let's shine a bit more spotlight on the meeting between the U.S. president and the Jordanian king today. The U.S. president wants Jordan to agree on relocation of Gaza's population to the country. Mr. Trump suspended aid to Jordan as part of a wider review into U.S. global funding. The consequences of losing U.S. aid is likely to be a dire situation in a country where a quarter of the population live in poverty. Political figures say the consequences of bowing to U.S. pressure could be more serious following the growing number of refugees and the lack of jobs. Jordan already houses more than 2.3 million displaced Palestinians. The king says his country is at a boiling point as he reportedly faces a choice: refuse the demands of a superpower ally or force open fault lines that could trigger an existential crisis. Let's bring in a former advisor to Israeli Prime Ministers Naftali Bennett and Benjamin Netanyahu, Daniel Rubenstein. He joins us from Tel Aviv. A pleasure having you on the program.
Thank you and good evening.
Right, so first of all, what do you make of the U.S. president's statement placing the power in the hands of the Israeli government, whether or not to call off the ceasefire?
Well, first of all, Hamas announced first that it was calling off the ceasefire, and the American president responded by saying that Hamas has until Saturday at noon to release all of the hostages. Today is Tuesday. I think President Trump's comments are quite generous because it gives Hamas another 4 days to hold all of the hostages that has been holding for nearly 500 days. Hamas is starving the hostages, torturing the hostages, keeping them in underground tunnels without sunlight for nearly 500 days. We cannot wait any longer for the hostages to come home, and we need the whole world to say with a loud and clear voice that Hamas needs to end the war that it started and let the hostages go home.
There have been many meetings leading into the actual action of releasing those hostages. Will it not be considered an act against goodwill and good faith if Israel backs out now?
It is a challenge to speak about goodwill because the situation that we're talking about is not a deal between business partners or even a deal between enemies who have decided to stop fighting. We're not talking about a deal, we're talking about a ransom payment. Israel has agreed to pay a huge ransom payment to the Hamas terrorist army in exchange for the hostages that Hamas has been holding for nearly 500 days. This ransom payment is in the form of convicted Palestinian terrorists, people who have murdered people, people who have sent people to murder people. They have been sentenced in Israeli prisons, and they are being released because Hamas is demanding them. It's as if Hamas has said, hey, we have your children, we have your sons and daughters. If you want your sons and daughters back, you have to release our convicted terrorists from jail who may take hostage your mother and grandmother tomorrow. This is the enemy that we are facing. They have shown no goodwill whatsoever. The only end result that is acceptable is that Hamas cannot be the government of the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is a territory that borders Israel. It's walking distance from the houses where Hamas terrorists went house to house on October 7th, 2023, massacring people and taking hostages. Hamas needs to end the war that it started, give up power in the Gaza Strip, and release the hostages. Israel has agreed to pay a ransom in phases. Israel agreed to a phased deal which would see Hamas release a few hostages a week. We just saw last Saturday Hamas released 3 Israeli hostages who were emaciated. They had been starved. That is what led the American president to call for the release of all the hostages, because we know that Hamas is torturing them and starving them.
And calling off a ceasefire could be tantamount to calling off the exchange for Israeli hostages. Many families have been waiting eagerly to see loved ones. Do you think they have any more understanding of Prime Minister Netanyahu's strategy, even though this time it could be with the backing of the U.S. government?
The families of the Israeli hostages who have been in captivity for nearly 500 days have been living in agony since the moment their loved ones were taken, and they should receive the utmost consideration and respect for what they have been dealing with for the past 16 months. When Hamas announced that it did not want to continue with the ransom payment that it was receiving from Israel, again, it was Hamas that announced that it was calling off the hostage ransom payment that it was receiving, and the American president responded to this announcement by saying that, well, Hamas needs to release all of them right now, immediately, and it's up to Israel to decide how it wishes to proceed. Israel's options are quite limited. If Hamas continues to hold the hostages and continues to starve them, we can only assume that the hostages are in worse condition than what we saw from the released hostages last week. Their lives are in danger. We need them home immediately, and Hamas needs to hear with a loud and clear voice from the whole world that it's completely unacceptable to hold hostages, and Hamas needs to move on so that Israeli and Palestinian children alike can have a better future than the past that they've had for the past 16 months.
Well, I'm sure the Israeli government is watching keenly for that meeting between President Trump and the King of Jordan. Mr. Trump appears to be arm-twisting Gaza's neighbors into receiving refugees, thereby implementing his plans for evacuation of the Gaza Strip. Jordan is an ally of Israel. How does the Israeli government feel about what's going on?
Jordan is certainly an important partner of Israel. Israel has had a peace treaty with Jordan since 1994. The American president has tried to suggest that the people of Gaza, who have been living in a war zone because their government started a war 16 months ago by invading Israel and massacring 1,200 people and taking 251 hostages, the president of the United States is now suggesting that the people of Gaza go somewhere else because their territory is not fit for habitation after the war that was brought to them. One of the ways that they can have a better life is if other countries give them long-term entry visas or citizenship. Jordan is close by, and there are many Palestinians in Jordan. However, I would give careful consideration to this because we do not know who in Gaza is a Hamas member or is a Hamas sympathizer. I would not want Hamas sympathizers to move to Jordan and set up along Israel's longest border and expand the war from Gaza to the Kingdom of Jordan. I think there can be a common sense approach that works, but ultimately, I think the solution is that the people of Gaza stay where they are and build better lives in Gaza, but it has to be a life of peace with Israel instead of war with Israel.
Well, this is a Trump move I think Israel is trying to, as much as possible, to steer clear of. But do you think there's consideration for the implications of a forced refugee situation in on Jordan?
Absolutely, I think there is consideration. The policy of the Israeli government is that people who want to leave Gaza should be able to leave Gaza, and any nation around the world that wants to help them should be encouraged to welcome them in. This is what we are talking about. Aside from this, we are still in an active war where Hamas is the government of Gaza. Hamas is the government of Gaza. It's the Hamas government that decided to go to war, to invade Israel. And before we can think about anything else, we need a solution for Gaza where Hamas is not the government of Gaza and Hamas is not holding hostages. Only after this point can we begin to think and build a better future, one that is not based on war, but is based on living in peace side by side as good neighbors.
Daniel, thanks once again.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we'll be back to the U.S. president a little while later, but staying in the United States, the Justice Department is telling federal prosecutors to drop their corruption case against New York City Mayor Eric Adams. That came from the acting deputy attorney general appointed by U.S. President Donald Trump, who said the indictment had restricted the mayor's ability to address illegal immigration and violent crime in the city. Mr. Adams, a Democrat, has recently built a closer relationship with President Trump, a Republican, and has told law enforcement to cooperate with the president's immigration raids, but he denies speaking to Mr. Trump about his case. The mayor is accused of accepting illegal campaign funds and gifts in exchange for his influence as mayor. He has pleaded not guilty to 5 charges. Prosecutors have not yet commented to indicate whether they intend to drop the case as requested. Any decision to do so will need to be formally submitted to the court and approved by a judge. And we're still in the United States, but back to President Donald Trump and his trade tariffs on steel and aluminium, many feel are targeted at Canada. Mr. Trump says he will levy a 25% import tax on all steel and aluminium products entering the U.S. from March 12 this year. Canada remains the top exporter of both metals. The industry minister, Francois Philippe, has described the tariffs as totally unjustified. Since returning to office last month, Mr. Trump has announced a wide range of these tariffs to try to protect U.S. jobs and industries. Economists say they are likely to raise prices for ordinary Americans. The U.S. imports 6 million tons of Canadian steel products and more than 3 million tons of aluminium products per year, more than from any other country. Canada argues that Canadian metal experts are making them more than North America as a whole more competitive and secure. Canadian province leaders too have condemned Mr. Trump's plan. Quebec's Francois Legault said his province alone sent millions of tons of aluminium to the U.S. per year, asking whether Mr. Trump would prefer to source the metal from his rival China. Opposition leader Pierre Poilievre said that he would issue matching tariffs targeting the U.S. if elected as Canadian Prime Minister. Meanwhile, the UK says it will not retaliate immediately to the renewal of the steel and aluminium tariffs by the United States. The tariffs set to apply from March 12, 2025 would mean any steel or aluminium coming into the U.S. would be subject to an import tax worth 25% of its value. Many in the industry are calling on Britain to join the EU and Canada, who have said they will hit back against the policy announced by U.S. President Donald Trump on Monday. UK ministers will meet the steel industry and unions later on Tuesday and visit key steel companies later this week. The UK's direction of travel on tariffs in general appears to be a clear attempt to differentiate it from other G7 allies' attempts to project strength to the White House. Tariffs apply to companies buying from overseas, not to the overseas companies selling to them. Joining us now is Professor of International Economic Relations and consultant, ECOWAS Common Investment Market. He joins us from Abuja, Nigeria. Professor Jonathan Remu, thanks for joining us today on the program.
Thank you, madam.
Right, so can the Trump tariff on steel and aluminium work on countries not in agreement with the policy?
Well, thank you, Madam. I've been hearing the story you are talking about, and seriously speaking, I feel scared, because scared in the sense that economists have believed in free trade. And when a country is taking unilateral decisions without reference to international agreement, both at the regional level and at WTO, and then thinking that it can do everything on its own, that's why I'm feeling scared. I've attended some WTO ministerial conferences, and I know how much a lot of negotiation has gone into get into some of these agreements. And a lot of regional agreement also has a lot of negotiation before they can arrive at some of the agreement on the percentages of the tariff. But your country, without negotiating with the other contracting parties, just standing up and then saying, he changes, he changed that. It has never happened in the history of trade. So I feel scared. That's my initial reaction. I've been listening and listening, and I feel scared. And I really support the UK position that is still looking at it, because that thing cannot stand.
Right. Are there predicted, huge gains for the U.S. economy in light of this policy?
You said what again, madam?
Does the U.S. president expect huge gains, for the economy in light of this policy?
No. Free trade is a gain for all. Free trade is a gain for all, particularly when it's a free trade that is negotiated and agreed upon. And when it is an economic integration in which you can better yourself, that is, I'm talking of contracting partners, then you are going to enjoy more. But look at the situation of Canada, Mexico, and United States that are into agreement on North Atlantic Free Trade Area, and then all of a sudden, a president of one of the three countries just standing up and saying that without reference to NAFTA agreement, he's not changing the rate. So it's going to affect a lot of economic interaction and integration. It's going to affect a lot of trading agreements which have been signed over a long range of months and years, in which supplies of one of the products will have to be implemented. So it's not going to be good for USA, because they tell they are going to gain. It's a crude economics which they are applying, in the sense that a freer trade is good for all, not only a situation where one person is enjoying it. If USA is putting import duty on products, even those that are input into their production equation in USA, as I'm talking of USA, they are putting import duty high on those inputs. That means the cost of those production in USA will be expensive. That means that the product they are producing in that place will be expensive. And then when they wanted to sell it, it will.
Right, so Canada, which is, the top exporter of steel and aluminium to the United States, it intends to retaliate the latest trade barriers. Would it make a huge impact, on the U.S. as well, aside from, the expected impact on, the U.S. citizens themselves? You said that things will become more expensive for them.
That's exactly what I said, because U.S. is a huge user of steel products. And then if they are going to say, any steel product coming in, we are going to put substantial import duty on it. Excellent. Because those products are intermediate products that are going to production processes that will affect the output of U.S. product before they sell to other parts of the world. Then U.S. will end up being competitive, particularly in their export products that uses those inputs that are attached to the initial importation of iron and steel products, where they are getting it from and where they want to impose higher import duty. So it's not going to be beneficial to them. They're only thinking of the money they are going to get in terms of tariff. They are not thinking about the production equation and cost is going to affect, as well as many people that will be laid off in US because the company will not be able to produce competitively to be able to export into the global international market.
And why do you think the UK is not towing the line of Canada and some other countries who want to, issue a retaliatory action on the US?
Well, I pity Canada, just to start from that one first. Why? Because Canada believes that under the principle of Pacta sunt servanda, that's the Vienna Convention of 1969, which says that whatever agreement you actually sign, you are bound by it, and you cannot use your domestic activity to be able to invalidate international treaty. On the basis of that, Canada is now reacting that you can't do that because we signed NAFTA agreement together. UK did not sign that kind of agreement. I'm saying economic integration agreement. But again, UK appear to be a little bit more conscious. More conscious in the sense that they are looking at all these things that is going to have a sort of effect on USA economy, that they will be forced to be able to change some of these very tough policies they are imposing on themselves, not on the world. On themselves in the sense that if it becomes unprofitable to trade with USA, they will turn to other parts of the world and trade with them. And then in the end, USA will be isolating himself from international trade.
Certainly.
So I like the position of UK. That's a good one.
Right. And I know that we're talking about Canada and the UK and some other countries that want to or feel the need to retaliate. But as America's fourth trading partner in 2024, do you think Nigeria may likely be affected by the trade tariffs, either directly from the United States or the UK and Canada, countries we have equally strong trade relations with?
Well, you see, despite Nigeria's position with respect to USA as a trading partner, and number 4, when you look at the volume of trade of Nigeria within the global trade, it's still extremely very, very low. So I don't think that we need to do anything now. All what we need to do is to watch and see. That's number 1. Secondly, some of the products which is leaving Nigeria to USA, what are they? Are they those things that will be affected? Have they been announced that it's going to affect those products? If the answer is no, then why are you saying that it won't be your turn, and then you want to take a possibly an action to be able to question yourself by the time USA descend on you? I don't think we need to actually entertain fear in that area. And more importantly, Nigeria has been making other friends apart from USA. Nigeria is one of the BRICS. Nigeria is negotiating a lot of treaty agreements with so many other countries. And therefore, Nigeria will not be worse off even if USA start their policy that can affect Nigerian export. But I don't think that any of the products leaving Nigeria, they are going to affect United States. Why? Because most of them are primary products. They are not processed or manufactured products that actually compete with USA manufacturing products. So, I think we just say where we are and watch and see what is going to happen.
Right. A pleasure having you again on the program, Professor of International Economic Relations and consultant to ECOWAS Common Investment Market in Abuja, Professor Jonathan Aremu.
Thank you.
Now let's check in on South Africa, where economists are assessing the potential impact of rising tensions between South Africa and the United States on the local economy, as U.S. President Donald Trump fuels uncertainty among global investors. Mr. Trump and his administration have been vocal in their criticism of South Africa's land reform policies, particularly the Expropriation Act. Since the law was enacted last month, fresh concerns have emerged over Mr. Trump's portrayal of its effects on private property in South Africa. Our South Africa correspondent, Innocent Simosa, reports.
Some opposition parties in South Africa argue that the United States is unfairly penalizing the country due to misunderstanding of the Expropriation Act. But what real economic risks does South Africa face if U.S. investors react negatively to President Donald Trump's rhetoric on the policy? Makwe Maselela, Chief Investment Officer at Makwe Fund Managers, weighs in.
The economic risks are real as the U.S. investors and businesses wouldn't want to be seen as going against their president. We know already we're trying to get the AGOA thing to be extended, and nothing has been done so far. And as we've seen yesterday, that the U.S. president has mentioned that he's planning to announce a blanket 25% tariff on all steel and aluminium imports today. And as a country, our steel industry is particularly vulnerable to this new policy.
Masilela emphasizes that both the South African government and private sector should implement strategic measures to reassure global investors and safeguard economic stability amid rising political tensions with the USA. Meanwhile, Claude Castle, director of Free South Africa, warns that Trump's stance could weaken the rand and drive inflation higher.
The first concern being a decline in investor confidence that could lead to capital withdrawal from South African markets, weakening the rand and increasing inflationary pressures. Secondly, reduced foreign direct investment as South Africa relies on FDI to fund its infrastructure and job creation. A decline in American investments could slow economic growth and employment opportunities.
She stresses the urgent need for a clear and proactive policy response from the South African government. As debates continues over the potential economic fallout, all eyes are on how South Africa navigates these external pressures while maintaining investor confidence. From Johannesburg, South Africa, Innocent Samosa, Channels Television News.
Our correspondent in Washington, Maria Bird, joins us now for an insight into a lot of these stories that we've been talking about. Maria, great to see you again today.
Good to see you as well.
Right, so I'll start from, just where we ended, some of these stories just before you came up. The world seems to be, more and more confused about why President Trump is slapping trade tariffs on countries, his trading partners, a lot of them. The latest being, the aluminium tariffs on Canada and, some other countries saying they're going to retaliate. Is this still about, is the America First policy, or is there something that we don't know that the president is trying to do?
Well, what we know is that, as you said, as we discussed previously, these tariffs are something that he said on the campaign trail. He came in the door day one focusing on tariffs. The issue really is about making sure for his administration that they're able to find ways to revitalize the economic infrastructure in the United States. We know there's been great promises in the steel industry. There's been great promises in the Midwest of the country where a lot of the manufacturing companies have gone under, to be quite honest. There's been a very large shift in the workforce in the United States, focused more on technology, healthcare, and some of the more trade and manufacturing fields have really struggled. And so the president, obviously a large part of his base were those individuals who lost their jobs, who were manufacturers, who worked in the steel industry, who were coal miners. And so this is an area that he is going to pay special attention to. And even if it impacts the partnerships and the global economic structure that has been developed and some of these trade partners that have been developed, I think that he's willing to initially risk that. And he's trying to see if he can revitalize the U.S.'s aluminum steel economy. And at this point, he's really focused in on being able to bring in as much economic or much income as he can for the United States, because it is very clear that he's focusing on efficiency, cutting back, but also trying to find ways to increase the economic base in the United States. We know the U.S. has been in quite a bit of a deficit for some time. We know in his previous administration that was one of the challenges, and one of the criticisms was around the deficit that was left behind.
And how is this affecting, those that the president seemingly is trying to help? There are a lot of concerns that, the businesses that, are tied to these products coming into the U.S. will suffer at the end of the day, and ultimately the consumers who will be at the losing end. Let me put it that way.
Well, the real question is around what are the plans and the strategies being put in place to revitalize manufacturing of these materials in the United States, specifically aluminum, as we've been discussing. What is the plan around that? We know that these are dying industries and industries, quite honestly, that have not been underway and vibrant for many years now. And so, to your point, companies that are relying on trade partners to provide these materials are definitely going to be somewhat at risk. And they are already stating that this could put them behind in being able to produce some of the goods that are produced right here in the United States, specifically car companies and companies that are dealing with building across the United States.
Right, so Maria, let's get to some of the other stories coming in from the U.S. today, such as the Justice Department, telling federal prosecutors to drop their corruption case against New York City Mayor Eric Adams. Help us understand what the Justice Department is trying to achieve. Is it working to free Eric Adams of all the charges?
Well, what has been stated is that the Justice Department has obviously looked at Mayor Adams and the work that he's done in New York, and specifically around the immigration raids and some of what he was working on very early in his administration. And so the question is whether or not he has been in communication with the Trump administration, whether or not he is at all becoming friendly with the administration, and is that why we're seeing this call to drop the cases. And so I think this is going to be a continued story that will be unraveling over the next few days, potentially. But it's a very interesting dynamic here, having a Democratic mayor who has definitely been very clear that he is very liberal in nature and focused on oftentimes what might be considered very opposite policy items as the president is focused on.
Well, are there any grounds of this happening? I know Adams enjoys a close relationship with the U.S. president, but wouldn't this be him drawing up favors on something he was accused of doing even before the current administration?
Well, what we know is that this is going to be something that we know that Adams has a strong Democratic base. We know that despite what we've seen with the corruption allegations and what he's dealing with legally, that he still has individuals that believe in the work that he's done in New York City. And so, but we also know that the president has strong ties to New York City. We know that that was his home for quite some time and that he has heavily been involved in the economic and political base in New York. And so, as you mentioned, there are allegations of them having close ties and friendly relationship, but totally opposite when you talk about policy. And so this will be very interesting to see how Mayor Adams responds to this and if these charges are dropped, because obviously we're in a moment in time in American history where people are very concerned around corruption in government and they are very concerned around having cases dropped prior to being heard and the American people having the chance to know the realities of what's happening behind the scenes in offices where they're not having privy to.
Right, and what happens if this request, does not go through? Is the mayor still open to prosecution?
Yes, if this does not go through, the mayor will continue forward with the cases. There will be a continued due process that will go underway.
And, talk to us about the precedent this sets for future similar cases in the United States.
Yes, this is setting a precedent for what we might see. But we know that the president stated when he was going through the campaign and when there's several cases brought up against him that it was a witch hunt against him. And so we know that others that are facing similar situations as he did will likely be requested by his administration to have cases dropped, especially if what they've aligned with and obviously the immigration raids that he sees that Mayor Adams did previously are in alignment with some of his key focal points with his administration. But it's a very interesting dynamic having a Democrat and a Republican, especially in times where there is a very polarizing environment between the Democratic and Republican Party.
And Maria, just to remind our viewers that the charges against the New York City mayor are based on a 57-page indictment brought against him in September of last year. Adams is alleged to have accepted illegal gifts worth over $100,000 from Turkish citizens and at least one government official. The Turkish officials are believed to have sought favors from the mayor, including his help skirting safety regulations to open a consulate in New York, according to prosecutors. You know, we just talked about the precedent that this sets for future and similar cases. And I'm sure you unpacked all that in your reply, just to tell our viewers what was happening. Well, thanks again, Maria, for your time and all the updates from today. And over in Asia, an 8-year-old girl has been stabbed at an elementary school in South Korea, an incident that has shocked the nation. The girl was found with stab wounds on the second floor of a school building at about 6 p.m. local time on Monday and was pronounced dead at the hospital. The teacher, said to be in her 40s, confessed to stabbing her. She was found beside her with the stab wounds that police said might have been self-inflicted. Police said in a briefing earlier today that the teacher is currently recovering in hospital and that the wound on her neck has been stitched. The Daejeon Educational Office earlier said the teacher had requested a 6-month leave of absence citing depression on December 9, but had returned to school just 20 days later after a doctor assessed her as being fit to work. The Education Office, however, said that days before the stabbing, the teacher had displayed violent behavior, including putting another teacher in a headlock. The Education Office is said to be investigating the matter. Well, same with crime and criminality, police in Australia have issued a continent-wide arrest warrant for a woman believed to have posed as a shaman to defraud victims of large sums of money. The suspect is a 44-year-old Austrian citizen named only as Mariana M., who went by the name Amila. Her 29-year-old son has been arrested and is in custody in the town of Wiener Neustadt. Police said they discovered cash, jewelry and gold worth over 10 million euros at a house in Mortlin near Vienna. Police say they believe Mariana M. may have defrauded people in Austria, Germany and Switzerland. They say Mariama M. told one victim that a close relative had been cursed and that she foresaw her death in order to break this alleged curse. The accused then demanded 730,000 euros for cleansing rituals. The Under-Secretary General of the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, Vladimir Voronkov, has told the Security Council that the volatile situation in the Syrian Arab Republic is of great concern, especially as there's a risk that stockpiles of advanced weapons could fall into the hands of terrorists. Briefing the Council on the threats posed by the international peace and security, Voronkov noted that the Syrian Badia region continued to serve as a center for Daesh external operation planning and a critical region for their activities. He also expressed concern over the situation in detention camps and other facilities in the northeast of the country.
Terrorist groups around the world is a top priority for the Trump.
The volatile situation in the Syrian Arab Republic is of great concern, especially as there is a risk that stockpiles of advanced weapons could fall into the hands of terrorists. The Syrian Badia region continues to serve as a center for Daesh external operational planning and a critical region for their activities. This instability also affects the camps, detention, and other facilities in the northeast of the country. The resilience of terrorist groups underscores the need for sustained international collaboration. Member states must prioritize comprehensive, long-term responses that address the conditions conducive to terrorism, while strengthening the rule of law and upholding international human and humanitarian rights.
Addressing these challenges.
Meanwhile, following the recent detention by the Houthi de facto authorities of 8 additional United Nations personnel, including 6 working in Saada, governorate, which has impacted the organization's ability to operate. The Secretary General has instructed the agency's funds and programs of the United Nations, the absence of the necessary security conditions and guarantees, to pause all operations and programs in the governorate in Yemen. UN Deputy Spokesperson Farhan Haq describes the situation as seeking to balance the operative imperative to stay and deliver with the need to have the safety and security of the UN personnel and its partners guaranteed.
Following the recent detention by the Houthi de facto authorities of 8 additional United Nations personnel, including 6 working in Sada Governorate, which has impacted our ability to operate, the Secretary General has instructed the agencies, funds, and programs of the United Nations, in the absence of the necessary security conditions and guarantees, to pause all operations and programs in Sada Governorate, Yemen. This extraordinary and temporary measure seeks to balance the imperative to stay and deliver with the need to have the safety and security of the UN personnel and its partners guaranteed. Such guarantees are ultimately required to ensure the effectiveness and sustainability of our efforts. This pause is to give time to the de facto authorities and the United Nations to arrange the release of arbitrarily detained UN personnel and ensure that the necessary conditions are in place to deliver critical humanitarian support guided by the principles of impartiality, neutrality, independence, and humanity. The United Nations remains fully committed to assist the millions of people in need across Yemen.
The coordinator for the Mine Action and Land Rehabilitation Initiative of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in Ukraine has been collecting soil samples in Ukraine's agricultural land impacted by remnants of war and exploded ordnance. Tiffany Lucas arrived in Ukraine in mid-2023 as FAO officer and since then has been driven by her aspiration to contribute to the recovery of Ukraine as an agricultural powerhouse. Despite the challenges of the ongoing war, Ukraine has harvested 72.9 billion tons of grains and oilseeds and exported 17.5 billion tons of cereals, legumes and flour in the current marketing year, surpassing last year's figures but not yet reaching pre-war levels.
The government is currently facing numerous challenges. They are in a state of war, so they need this technical assistance. And I truly believe that we can provide this technical assistance in the best possible way. And that's why we are accepting the risk, because we know that that's our role. And that's the way people can also protect their own livelihood. Triticum durum, the wheat that is grown for pasta. This type of wheat might not be suitable for a field that is contaminated with cadmium because it has this capacity to accumulate cadmium. But another type of wheat that is grown for bread, for instance, has less capacity to accumulate cadmium. And in this case scenario, you might recommend the farmer to grow this type of wheat instead of another wheat that it might have been cultivated before or had planned to cultivate. The knowledge and science are really key, because what matters is what you bring to the table. So if you are able to bring knowledge, if you are able to transform this knowledge into a solution, then you are listened. And that's really where you will make your mark. And it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman.
The United States has called for the release of former Nigerian President Mohamed Bazoum and his wife, who've been arbitrarily detained since his ouster by a military junta in June 2023. Since June 26 of that year, Mr. Bazoum and his wife, Hadiza, have been held at the presidential palace in Niamey in strict detention. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention said in a report recently that the deprivations of liberty of Mr. Mohamed and his wife are arbitrary. The group says the appropriate measure would be to immediately free him and to grant the family the right to obtain compensation. And the trial has begun of 84 Congolese soldiers accused of murder, rape and other crimes against civilians in the country's conflict-battered east. The soldiers are accused of having broken into civilian homes in several villages of the Kabare and Kalehi territories in the eastern province of South Kivu over the weekend, raping several women and killing at least 12 people. The accused soldiers were brought before a military court in Bukavu, the provincial capital of South Kivu, on Monday. The civil party requested the death penalty for all of the accused people. Congo lifted a more than 20-year moratorium on the death penalty in March, a decision criticized by rights activists. The last execution took place in 2003. South Sudan's President Salva Kiir has made radical changes to his cabinet by sacking 2 of his vice presidents, the country's spy chief, and other senior officials. No reasons were given for the changes, which were announced in a series of presidential decrees read on national television. The country has 5 vice presidents as part of a 2018 peace agreement to end a civil war. One of the vice presidents removed from office is James Wani Iga, a veteran politician and general who has been in the position since 2013 and has been the deputy chair of the SPLM, the party of the president. The other is Hussein Abdelbagi Akol from an opposition alliance, which is not part of the main opposition movement of first Vice President Riek Machar. Mr. Akol has been appointed the Minister for Agriculture, replacing Josephine Lagu from the same SSOA alliance, who now becomes a Vice President. And we'll be ending the program all the way in the Mount of Temptation in Jericho, where the Special Advisor on Christian Matters to the Lagos State Government is leading pilgrims to pray for the growth of Nigeria. Mr. Bukola Adeleke says the Mount of Temptation is a significant place in the Bible where the Lord Jesus Christ defeated the devil after he was tempted 3 times. He also says he believes that every prayer rendered on the Mount for Nigeria will be answered.
On day 2 of the tour, Christian pilgrims moved from the Aluminium border crossing between Jordan and Israel to Jericho to visit the Mount of Temptation in the state of Palestine. The first group arrives at Jericho and takes a cable car ride to the top of the mountain overlooking the city on the west bank. The team alights from the cable car, moves straight to the Mount of Temptation to have a first-hand experience of the place, built on the slopes 350 meters above sea level. Some visited historic locations inside the structure where Jesus spent 40 days and 40 nights fasting and praying.
This is the oldest city in the whole world, Jericho. And we are at Mount Temptation, where Jesus Christ was tempted. And when the devil took him to the pinnacle of the mountain and was tempted, and to the glory of God, Jesus conquered the plans of enemy. He conquered the devil and his cohort, where we have to pray for our state, particularly Mr. Babajide Olusola Sanwo-Olu, that no weapon formed against him shall prosper. We also pray for Nigeria. We pray for our president.
One of the ministers leading the group encouraged those participating in the pilgrimage exercise to seek the power of the Holy Ghost.
The Bible gave us a record in the book of Luke chapter 4 that when Jesus was returning, he returned with the power of the Spirit. So anything you may look for or ask for you may need in all these biblical sites is power. When you get power, you have the authority. As you say it, as you speak it, it comes to pass.
Then team members converge in a section of the Mount of Temptation for a group prayer session. The Mount of Temptation is situated along a cliff overlooking the city of Jericho and the Jordan Valley. An ancient structure built above the cave dates back to the 6th century. The pilgrims complete the tour for the day and leave the premises with a cable car, looking forward to the next pilgrimage exercise.
We're back from the mountain. That's our program today. Thank you so much for watching. Joker Rogers.